Hello, I'm Calum Di Lieto. We are here today at White City to interview Lucy Adams, the departing HR Director of the BBC. Right, great to see you, Lucy. You spoke at our conference a couple of years ago, and now you've been on quite an adventure with the BBC. You've been there for 5 years now, and you're here to speak with us on your departure. So thank you for taking the time to speak with HR Grapevine. Firstly, I guess as a roundup of the 5 years, what kind of highlights have you had in your career here?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me to do this. And it's been an absolutely unbelievable 5 years. It's been an incredible experience and one I've enjoyed very, very much. And I think when you look at what the BBC's done in the last 5 years, we've kind of created the new BBC up in Salford, BBC North. We've created the biggest multimedia newsroom in Europe, moved everybody in there from Bush House, where they were, the World Service, Television Centre, and obviously the people who were still based there, but moving them all into the one area. There was the Olympics, incredible experience, and major news stories like Arab Spring a couple of years ago. I think what I'm particularly proud of is the fact that the only way that all of those things were possible was having the right people trained in the right way, in the right place, and so on. And that's obviously down in huge part down to my team. So just having been a part of all of that has been an incredible experience, and I'm very proud of the work my team's done there. Also over the 5 years there's been some really difficult stuff as well. We've had obviously major funding reductions, and that's meant that we've had to major redundancies, pay constraints, and pension reform, and taking over 30% of our senior managers out. And whilst they're not highlights, they're incredibly difficult things to do and very difficult for the individuals who are affected. But again, I'm very, very proud of the way that my team handled all of those things, and so I would see that as something that I'm incredibly proud of. There was obviously Savile and the Savile crisis, which perhaps we'll talk about as we go on, but I think that clearly for the victims, that was Jimmy Savile, that was the most hideous thing, but I was very proud of the way that the BBC, and something that myself and my team led, was a real in-depth look at bullying and harassment. And I think we've been really brave there, and we've gone much, much further than many other organisations, both within the media industry and outside of the media industry. So I think I'm particularly proud of that piece of work. On a personal level, highlights, I'm a massive football fan, so the opportunity to sit on the Match of the Day sofa was fairly fantastic, and sit with the production team and watch the way they put that programme that I've watched every week since I was a little girl go out, and also sit alongside Alan Hansen and Gary Lineker was a fairly high point.
So who do you support?
Chelsea, a big Chelsea fan, so we've got a big game tonight against Man City, so I think we'll probably get whooped, but it'll be fantastic to see. Also, I love dancing, and I got to see Strictly Come Dancing go out live, amazing. And also I got the opportunity to go out to Kabul and Gaza. I spent most of my time completely terrified, but to actually see the work that our journalists are doing there, day in, day out, was something I would never have experienced in any other run-of-the-mill organisation. So it's been an incredible 5 years. I can't say I've loved every minute of it, but I've loved an awful lot.
So one of the things you mentioned actually was the difficulties with everything going on with Jimmy Savile and things like that. How did you cope with that, and how did you get the rest of the team at the BBC to sort of deliver and solve that problem?
Well, I talked about the Olympics being a high for the BBC, and it was sort of record levels of approval from our audiences, and yet within a few weeks we were sort of descending into arguably one of the BBC's worst crises in its history, and it's had quite a few in its 90-odd years. And we had obviously the exposure of Jimmy Savile. We then had 2 Newsnight programmes with major editorial failings. We had the resignation of our Director General. We then went into the new year with, we had strikes. We had the failure of the Digital Media Initiative. We had sort of 4 Director Generals in the space of 12 months, and our approval ratings and reaction from audiences went to an all-time low. So it was this incredibly difficult period, culminating for me in my own sort of personal crises around the Severance last summer and into the early autumn. And as a team, it's incredibly difficult to go through those things because, you're obviously personally affected. You're trying to keep morale going. You're dealing with negative headlines every single day. Your people are getting a lot of their news from the newspapers, and when you've got 8,000 journalists working for you, it's quite hard to make sure that they hear from you first. So it was a very, very challenging period, both for the organisation and its people, but for me personally.
And as you said, there was your own personal crisis regarding the BBC severance payouts and things like that. How did you cope on a personal level, in that time?
Well, I think as a senior person, you get paid good money, and so it's your job to stand up and take the flak when things aren't going well. So, I'm not sort of feeling sorry for myself or anything, that goes with the territory. I think in my particular case, a lot of people wrote to me at the time and said that they'd felt that actually the press reaction had been, or perhaps on the more extreme end. I don't know whether that's true or not. It certainly felt quite intense for a period of time, and you kind of cope the way that every person copes when they're going through a difficult period. Your friends and family rally round, you try and keep a real sense of perspective, and you keep doing your job. So everyone says, eventually it dies down, and of course it does. It's very difficult when you're going through it. You're obviously on the receiving end of a huge amount of hostility, and it can get very, very personal. But you have to understand that it's not personal, and you are a figurehead for an organisation. You have been involved in making decisions that people were angry about, and so I think that you have to accept that it goes with the job.
And I guess there's always going to be severance pay in organisations, and especially with senior executives, there is going to be a certain amount of money involved when they do leave an organisation. Why do you think that the media did have such a hype about what was going on at the BBC, and also, what are your views in severance pay in general, I guess?
Well, the public were angry, and they had a right to be concerned. They were a large amount of money being paid out to quite a number of individuals, and I think that those legacy terms and conditions are clearly from a different era, and we've made significant changes to those terms and conditions now. What I regret is that I think in the media storm and the public outrage that followed was that there didn't seem to be a lot of room for balance in the debate. And I do regret that we didn't get some of the perhaps the alternative views out there. Firstly, that in the vast majority of cases people were getting their contractual entitlement. In a small number of cases where we paid more than contractual entitlement, we were doing so for good reasons. I think that we could have pushed harder, we could have challenged harder, we could have done things differently, and absolutely get that. But in the end, we saved the BBC £20 million a year, and we'll go on saving that £20 million year on year on year. So I think on balance, we were achieving more than perhaps came over at the time, and there didn't seem to be a lot of room for that kind of reasoned debate, which I do regret. Any HR director is trying to do a number of things when they're looking at a severance arrangement. You're trying to balance the needs of the business. In our case, we were trying to drive out large numbers of individuals and cost, and you're trying to balance the needs of the individual. Very often they are emotional, they don't want to go, they've been there for a long, long time, and you're trying to make sure that you move them out with dignity and with minimal operational disruption, and also to try and avoid tribunals. So you're trying to balance that, but you're also trying to balance that with the needs of the public perception of those arrangements. And I think in a number of cases we got that balance wrong. Any HR director is always trying to balance those three things, and it's a judgment call, and sometimes you get those right and sometimes you get those wrong.
I mean, as you say, severance pay is a massive challenge for the HR function. And your case was quite unique because it did get splashed around and stuff. But I think, obviously, when an organisation is trying to save money by spending money, it does seem counterintuitive to other people externally. So what can HR do to, ease the mind of not just the people outside the organisation, but also maybe their employees and stuff on the lower levels that are possibly equally as angry, but maybe not as public about it?
I think the role of HR is to make sure that all of the stakeholders who have an interest in what the severance payment is are represented. So as I said earlier, you're trying to represent the needs of the organisation, the needs to save money, the needs to do this effectively, quickly, with minimal disruption. You're trying to balance the needs of the individual and being fair and just to that individual and cope with what they're going through. And you're also trying to balance the needs of external stakeholders, shareholders, your own people. And I think that the role of HR is to make sure that all of those are represented, but ultimately that you are putting forward a view and putting forward a judgment about what that level of payment should be. As I say, sometimes you get that right, sometimes you get that wrong. What I think we could have done differently, and that we're certainly doing now, is we could have had more challenge to those numbers. And I think sometimes when you've got senior people who are making decisions about people within their own teams, sometimes they can get a bit blinkered. So I think actually making sure that there is real rigour in challenging the assumptions that have gone into arriving at that judgment, and certainly that's something that we've done. I think also that the BBC, we've put in place new redundancy terms and conditions for senior people, and we've put in a cap so nobody can earn more than a certain level, can take out rather more than a certain level. And I think we could have done that earlier. And HR being in tune with how appropriate those terms and conditions are given changing climates, but again balancing the legal rights of individuals. I'd proposed that we reduce terms and conditions for redundancy for high earners back in 2011, and I probably could have pushed harder on that because it wasn't accepted at the time. Sometimes you need a crisis though to drive these things through.
It's interesting. So you basically, if you'd pushed that a little bit harder in 2011, that whole crisis may have been avoided. Is that what you're saying in terms of, not that you would have foreseen what was happening, but you kind of already knew that there was something that needed to be changed, and now that there has. So we had already identified that we needed to reduce terms and conditions. The view that we took as an organisation was that when you've announced that you're going to take out 25%, 30% of jobs of senior managers and managers, that actually that's a really difficult time to be making changes to their redundancy terms. So I don't know whether that crisis could have been avoided. I don't know whether actually in the end we could have pushed those things through, because it's very tough to do that when you're announcing a redundancy programme and at the same time saying, oh, but by the way, we're going to cut the legal entitlement that you've got and that you've built up over 20, 30 years. Certainly we knew we needed to do something, but getting that timing right can be really tricky. Now, as you said, the idea was to not take it personally and to consider yourself a figurehead of the organisation. But some media channels, they really did focus on you personally. You're quite glamorous individual.
That's very kind of you.
And they pinpointed things like that. Being a senior woman, I think especially must have been quite difficult. So, how do you feel about that?
I don't sort of tend to picture myself like that. My daughter was thrilled because there was one article that said I was skinny, so she said, "Oh, nice one, Mum," you know. But you know, I think, you know, a senior woman in any crisis like this has got to accept that they're going to be the ones that are focused on. I think it's unfortunate that, you know, UK media in particular has a particular sort of idea of women, and they're usually portrayed as either incompetent or hard ball-breaking bitches, or sort of just one up from a hooker. And I seem to get a bit of all three of those. But yeah, I mean, you kind of have to ride it. Say, try not to take it too personally. I wasn't overly thrilled with the picture of me in my bikini. That wasn't great, particularly when some of the guys in my team had real fun with that. But you know, I think it's unfortunately symptomatic of the era that we're in. And yeah, so but you know, thanks for the compliment.
It's interesting you say about the sort of three kind of stereotypes of senior women. What can be done? I mean, is it from a woman's perspective, or from, you know, an organisation's perspective, or maybe even the media? What can be done to change that, so, you know, you don't have to fall into one of those three categories?
I think what fascinated me was that a lot of the comments that were written about me in terms of what I look like and so on were actually written by female journalists, and I would really love to see more and more female journalists actually challenging this and writing perhaps slightly more nuanced and intelligent pieces around women, and disregarding what they look like. But so, you know, that's not something I've got any control over. I think for what women can do, and I know a lot of senior women who increasingly are very, very comfortable in being both female, feminine, quite happy, you know, wearing makeup and caring about what they look like in clothes, but not seeing that as somehow being undermine their ability to actually do an effective senior role. I think it's a generational thing. I think, you know, the women that went before me and others that were sort of having to break through into leadership roles quite often needed to be tougher than some of the men that they were trying to work with and lead. I don't think that's the case so much today, and certainly I know my daughter's generation don't feel any problem with being very female, thinking about how they look, but also expecting to be treated equally. So I think it's going to be a generational thing. And when I'm mentoring when I'm mentoring junior women, my view would always be, you know, just be yourself. And one thing that's been great actually at the BBC is there are so many senior women, so it's just not an issue being a female here.
That's great. And I guess you talked a bit about mentoring, and obviously you're departing the BBC now. This is all behind you. You've had 5 great years. So what's the future for Lucy Adams?
Well, I'm definitely not going to go and jump straight into another big HRD role. You know, I was the Group HR Director at Serco, Eversheds, and now 5 years at the BBC. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but loads of people have reached out to me on the back of what I went through and have asked me to go and talk to them about what it's like to go through something like that, how do you recover from it, how do you deal with the pressures of that environment, and what does it take for a senior leadership to go through something like that happened at the BBC and show resilience. So I'm quite interested in exploring some of that from my personal experience in the BBC, but also as a senior HR person for a number of years. So I think I'm going to explore doing something around that.
And as a legacy, I guess, what have you left behind for the BBC? In your time.
I tend not to want to think about things like legacies, because I think that sort of sounds a bit pompous, doesn't it? You know, as if I've kind of, you know, the BBC's been around for a long, long time, and I don't really like the idea of sort of thinking in terms of my legacy. But I think that there are certain things that I'm particularly proud of. I mentioned the fact that, you know, we took out 30% of the senior leadership group. That saved £20 million for the year, which £20 million a year, which will go into programming, and I think that's got to be a good thing. I'm very proud of the work we did around bullying and harassment. I think it was an incredibly honest, brave thing to do, and we have put in place some real best practice around support for staff and line managers in that area. And I'm really proud of the team I've got here. They are fantastic. They are unsung heroes, and I think I leave behind a really, really strong team that we've tried, which is kind of my sort of mantra around HR, is that it should be earthy, it should be pragmatic, it should be approachable, and I think we've got a great team here that do that.
Well, thank you very much for talking with HR Grapevine, and I wish you all the best of luck for the future.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.